Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. Come on with us to Luke chapter 5. In Luke chapter 5, it's the account of the fishermen being called, those four men. Luke 5 verse 4, the Lord says to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answers and says, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word I will let down the net." When they did this, there was such a great multitude of fish that they were having trouble getting it even back to land. Their net was starting to break, it says in verse 6. They're starting to recognize that Jesus is Lord. Simon says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord," in verse 8. The Lord says in verse 10, "Do not be afraid, from now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. Let's talk about a few things. One is, those men, what they had to leave behind, they had to leave money behind. This was a business. But they recognized that as the Lord called for them, there was work to do. They left money behind, and very often that is the case with us. If we're going to be Christians, then we have to put our hand to the plow and not look back. And that's what these men did. They forsook all and followed the Lord. They also, you might consider, says Zebedee was there, the sons of Zebedee, and it mentions Zebedee being there, it looks like. Sometimes we leave family. Doesn't mean that we don't take care of them, doesn't mean that we don't love them or anything like that, but the Lord comes first. And we recognize, just as Jesus said, remember when his family came looking for him, and he looked around at those disciples and he said, here is my mother, here are my brothers, here are my sisters, those who do the will of my Father. That's who family is. They also left, consider something else they left. They left comfort. They were comfortable being fishermen. It was what they knew. They had probably spent their whole life doing this. We have to be willing to leave our comfort zone. That's what we have to do as the Lord calls us. What we are called to do is we're called to deny ourselves. We have to leave our life behind. When the Lord calls us, we follow him, we leave our life behind. But I want you to consider something that I really hadn't thought about before, because all those points are pretty familiar in the account. But notice verse 3. It says, "Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, 'Launch out into the deep and let down your nets.'" Think about Simon. He had been working all night. And the wonderful thing about Simon, there's so many good things about him. He had been working all night, and yet he was more than willing to listen to a sermon. He was more than willing to listen to Jesus preach. A lot of folks, they would have said, "You know what, I'm working all night. You're going to have to handle this on your own." But that wasn't Simon. What he did was he listened to the sermon. He listened to the sermon, and then when the Lord called him to act, he obeyed. And as he obeyed, he applied the lesson. He says, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." He understood, and he was starting to apply it to himself, and he was recognizing there were things that were a whole lot more important than a few fish. And he followed Jesus. When Jesus called, he followed him, along with those other men. And that is what we have to do. We have to listen, we have to obey, applying the lesson to ourselves, and we follow the Lord. Hope you enjoyed this study today. God bless you. Be a blessing to others. We hope to see you tomorrow morning.